Right. Welcome to our next session in our Parent Empowerment Conference. This one is entitled Those IQ Scores. What do they mean? And we are excited to welcome Mr. Madyun. He is in his first year here in PGCPS, and he is a school psychologist. He was a family engagement instructional coach for Intermediate District 287 in Plymouth, Minnesota. And he served at both the K-12 and post-secondary level. And he has over 20 years of experience as an educator. And we are excited to have him present tonight. So, Mr. Madyun, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. I guess that is my cue to start sharing my screen. So I would do so now. Yeah, so this is these IQ scores. What do they all mean? And I put IQ in quotation marks because I think that will become important later as we wrestle with or think through what is an IQ score. And I say a conversation with families as a subtitle to this because I think that is important also. A conversation is an invitation to interrupt at any point because there's clarification that needs to be offered. And I think that is important when it comes to IQ scores, always working to clarify. And then a conversation is also important because it's saying that or admitting that the person that's speaking cannot come to the conclusion alone with that person's own voice. And so it's an invitation for other voices to be part of it, to understand what everything means. So I invite anyone to interrupt at any point, and I see that as only adding to the presentation and helping me understand what this all means, because I'm still learning myself. And I'll point to what I mean by that. So the goals of this presentation is to better understand the term IQ or cognition. Sometimes they are used interchangeably, and we're going to get to why. To better understand why schools measure IQ in the first place, or as I said earlier, cognition. To better understand what different IQ or cognitive scores mean. And then with all of this better understanding, you will hopefully learn how to support your child's profile with a better understanding of IQ, better understanding of why we measure IQ in schools, and a better understanding of the different IQ scores. And so with those goals, I want to start off with a little video clip from a 1992 film called A Few Good Men. And this is a very short clip that I think is at the heart of what we're talking about. This slide is entitled The Search for Truth. And this clip is about a conversation between a defendant and a prosecutor, where the prosecutor, played by Tom Cruise, is trying to get from the defendant, played by Jack Nicholson, the truth. So let's play this clip for just a second, and then we'll come back and respond to it.
Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Very short clip. The prosecutor is demanding the truth from the defendant. And the defendant is reluctant to give what he thinks is the truth. And the judge is saying that you don't have to give it. And I think this is important. That's the dance we play as educators, as parents, and as students, trying to debate what information do we offer. At the same time, we're all asking for what we think the truth is. And in doing so, we offer different versions of the truth while we're all searching for what the truth really is. And that, in some ways, is the story of IQ testing. But let me go a bit further with that point. Some of you may be familiar with this folktale. It originated out of India, where these three different individuals who could not see, had heard about this creature called the elephant. And they heard about it so much that they wanted to go find for themselves what an actual elephant felt like to their senses, to their other senses that were stronger. So the sense of touch. And so they ventured out. And in the actual story, it's different from this cartoon. If you know the story for real, there's 6 individuals. But they went out and they searched and found an elephant. And each one touched the elephant and then reported back what they felt. Each one's version was different. One felt the trunk and thought it was a snake and said the elephant is more like a snake. Another one felt the tail and said elephant's more like a rope. One said it's a wall. Others felt that an elephant was more like this carpet type of creature or animal. And the important thing is that each one had their own version based on what their experience was, based on the part of the truth of who the elephant was or is, came from. And that is not unlike IQ. There's so many different perspectives of what intelligence is. So many that we disagree on even what the best synonym to intelligence is. Some think it's your ability to read someone else's feelings and emotions and having empathy. Some think it's how quickly you can come to a decision and process information. Some people think it's how well you can manipulate things with your hands. And everyone is right to some degree. Every perspective is right. And this has been part of the tug of war, but this is very important when we're talking about measuring intelligence in our schools. To keep in mind that everyone is looking at different parts of intelligence. The dictionary definition of intelligence is the ability to learn or understand or deal with new or trying situations, and the ability to apply knowledge to manipulate one's environment. And another way to understand that is being in a new situation. How well can you understand what that new situation is and then navigate that new situation? That new situation being the environment. And this cartoon is pretty funny to me because one person said, I survived climbing Mount Everest. That was a new situation that they learned how to survive or navigate. The second person said, I survived crocodile hunting. That was a new experience that they used the information, they had the ability to survive or navigate. The third person, I survived my state's high stakes testing. And they said, this person wins because there's so many different environments and they have to navigate. And our children, our students have to go through so many different levels and types of testing to get to the type of success we feel they need to achieve in order to be the type of students we want them to be after high school. And those different levels, that environment of testing is similar to how we measure IQ tests. It depends on the environment that you're looking at, which determines what type of intelligence needs to be measured. I'll say that again. It depends on the environment you're trying to navigate that determines what type of intelligence you should focus on. So what is an IQ? So we talked about intelligence, kind of the ability to adapt to a new environment, using the information that you have. When you start to compare your ability to adapt to a new environment to other people's ability to adapt to a new environment, then you're defining what is an intelligence quotient or an IQ. The Webster's definition is a number used to express the relative intelligence of a person. What is your ability to adapt to a new environment in comparison to someone else's ability to adapt to a new environment? Now, on the bar graph on the right, the colored bar graph, is one I want to use to kind of illustrate this a little bit. That's the birth weight. When a child is born, the average birth weight is 7.5 pounds, what we deem as average. Now, you can go down as far as 5 pounds and 8 ounces, or go up as high as 8 pounds and 13 ounces, and it's still considered average. They argue that 68 to 70% of the population will fall in between 5 pounds, 8 ounces, and 8 pounds, 13 ounces. That's considered the normal distribution of birth weight. A normal distribution, there's about 68% that falls within this particular range, or 70%. So what does that mean? That means that for us, if we're using that, when a child is 8 pounds and 12 ounces, we'll say that child is still within the average range, but kind of on the high average range for a baby that's newborn. If a child is 5 pounds 9 ounces, we say that child is still within the average range, but kind of in the low average range. But if the child becomes, for whatever reason, when the child is born 5 pounds 3 ounces, something in our society says that that baby seems to be in a different category of weight, and we might need to support that baby differently with different types of supports, or pay different types of attention to that baby in order to support that child as that child develops. May develop to be a normal baby, but we want to pay certain attention because statistically or historically or in our gut, a baby around 5 pounds 3 ounces or lower seems to be in a different category. And we would say the same thing with a child who is born in 9 pounds. Something in it says that child's born with a higher weight than other children. And so we want to track this baby just to see how this child will progress. This child may need different types of support or attention paid to him, her, or they. So that is how we look at IQ. It's your intelligence in comparison to someone else when that intelligence starts to look a little bit different than 68% of the population or the average population. Are there any questions at this moment? So now let's move this over to how we've started to use this in schools. Remember, I said 5 pounds 8 ounces to 8 pounds 13 ounces is kind of the average range for birth weight. That's kind of the average range for newborns when they're born. That's where 68 to 70% or so of the population will fall, roughly. Now, when it comes to intelligence scores or IQ scores, we're compared to other people, average is 80 to 119. When a child is 110 to 119, they're considered in the high average range. Similar to how we said 8 pounds and 13 ounces, 8 pounds 12 ounces, kind of in the high average range. When a child is 80 to 89, we consider the child in the low average range. Their score is kind of like that 5 pound 8 ounce, 5 pound 9 ounce, 6 pound baby. And if they're 90 to 109, they're considered in the average range. And 50% of the population will fall in the 90 to 109 range, but roughly 70%, a little bit more, will fall within the 85 to 115 range, and then 75 to 80% of the population will fall within the 80 to 119 range. And I stretch it out a little bit because that gets into kind of the murkiness and messiness of what we have had to do to measure average intelligence in the school system. So how do you measure it? How do you measure it? That's the question, right? That's what we've come here to answer. On the right, you see a coffee cup. And for some people, this is measuring when they're ready. Half of the coffee cup, they said they're almost ready. Once they get down to the bottom, that means they've consumed enough to show that they're ready. That is one way in which you measure when, ironically, someone is ready. How much information can they hold? On the left, the measuring cup with the cups, the ounces, the quarts, that's kind of what I need because I'm not a good cook. I really literally had to learn how to boil water. And I'm not joking. I had to learn how to boil water. I didn't know how much there was to really boiling water. And so the detail here is really important in helping me figure out what exactly I'm doing. And the detail that we use to measure IQ is what you need to pay attention to. What exactly are we measuring? And so people debate it. People argue over what to focus on. And we landed on, for the most part, after lots of debate where not everyone agreed, cognition, which is basically your ability with your mind to process or acquire knowledge through thought, experience, and your senses. Similar to what the individuals who could not see did earlier. Use their senses to acquire knowledge, make sense of it, and then apply it. That's cognition. And so we tried to develop cognitive tests to measure IQ. And we're getting closer to what we're doing in the school systems. So cognitive tests, they attempt to measure how well your mind can process the information that's coming in, hold the information, and then use that information to guide what you're doing. Process the information that's coming in, hold that information, and then use it to guide what you're doing, to navigate your environment, to understand where you are when the situation is new, when you have to adapt. And the first cognitive test, the first IQ test, it was designed in France, to determine who would be in need of extra support or would experience difficulty when they decided that schooling would be mandatory. So that is important. The way we're measuring IQ for schools is trying to determine who will need extra support. Who do we need to track in order to know how well would they do in school, or how much would they benefit from different types of instruction and schooling? How would they navigate the school environment? And so that is why in the cartoon earlier, the person who survived the high stakes testing won also, because she navigated what so many of our children have to navigate, the school environment. And so what we're trying to measure, the best that we can, is how well can someone navigate the school environment. And because they are entitled to a free education, an appropriate education, we have to measure it well so we can figure out what support would they need in order for them to have the ability to navigate that school environment and become who they have the capacity to become, and not allow the school to be the barrier to their success, but to put the supports into the school so they can become a success. So that is what we're actually trying to measure. So this is a little funky, but this is an important point I want to make. This gets to all the disagreement we have about intelligence. And if you see here, there are different levels to intelligence. And at the very bottom, it says 70 narrow abilities. That's why you can see some people who can perform very well in some areas of their ability to adapt to an environment and others not, because there's so many different things we're trying to measure at different levels. Now, what we landed on, this is kind of where we are agreeing, is these 7 in the middle. These fluid, crystallized, and I get to this later, visual processing, short term. These are kind of like the 7 main things we feel we should measure in order to determine the degree to which someone can adapt or adjust to their environment in school, and the degree to which we can support them or should support them. And we argue that these 7 particular areas should relate to an overall IQ score. So the IQ score that falls between 80 and 119, even though there may be fluctuations at the different levels, overall, we should capture where that person stands. But as you can see, even as I'm explaining this, you can see arguments here where there might be gaps, there might be disharmonies, there might be pieces that don't quite come out even. And that is important to pay attention to. Actually, that is the most important thing to pay attention to. But this slide mainly is to detail that we're trying to bring a lot of different smaller categories together into larger chunks, and those larger chunks into one small score or one single score. Even though we offer a range, for the most part, we're looking at one single score, which is the IQ score. So I'm going to tell you about the levels, how this plays out on the Wechsler Intelligence Scale, the WISC, one of the ones that is used most often in the schools. Again, the full scale IQ score that falls between 90 to 109 for 50% of the population, 80 to 119 for the majority of the population, is broken down into four main categories. Verbal comprehension, which I'm going to go over in a little bit, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. As you can see, there are these four main categories we look at to determine the degree to which your child may need support in the school and try to measure. And below, you can see again, these different abilities that we try to measure that should feed into verbal comprehension, the vocabulary, comprehension. For processing speed, there's a subtext called coding and symbol search. We're looking at all these little subtests, all these smaller subtests that should build up into these larger chunks of categories that should feed into this overall general IQ. Are there any questions so far? So what are those categories? So verbal comprehension is mostly your child's ability to sit in a conversation, understand the conversation, and participate in a conversation. So when we're measuring verbal comprehension, mostly we're wanting to know to what degree should we think about how well your child is understanding the conversation in the classroom. Do we need to increase their understanding of basic vocabulary so they can participate in the conversation? Because sometimes maybe they don't have a good understanding of the words that are being used. Visual spatial is the ability to understand where and locate where things are in space and move them around. So one of the ways I talk about this, some individuals have a very good skill at designing things or figuring out where to move things in space. And they can just see those things with their mind and they can organize those things. And they sometimes have a better skill with doing mental operations in their mind where they have to flip shapes and objects and they become really good designers. And that's what we're looking at. To what degree is your child really good at moving objects with their mind, figuring out where things may fit or not fit, or might need support or understanding how to parallel park, how to draw different shapes and angles to fit in different situations, or just see those types of things. Fluid reasoning is your child's ability to detect a relationship among objects and then understand the rules of those relationships. And when they're understanding the rules of those relationships, they're doing problem solving. They're being able to say, if this moves this way and that moves that way, then they have this type of relationship. So we use this particular fluid reasoning to determine the degree to which your child can kind of think forward and make decisions and problem solve into the future. They're understanding how these two things are relating together in the now moment. So then they're going to be able to pick up on patterns. So if your child struggles in this area, then we start to look to see how do we support them to problem solve things into the future. This is not necessarily a measure of whether your child can think, but how much practice do they have at thinking through into the future based on how things relate to each other. Working memory. This is similar to what we talked about earlier in terms of holding information. This is how well can your child hold information in the now and then use it in the now. So it's similar to how we talk about short-term memory. and a person's ability to have the information in their mind in about 3 to 12 seconds of time. But then what do they do with it in that moment? A good example would be give a child a grocery list or a couple of items to do. Can they keep it in their mind and they remember it and use it? So your ability to hold information for a short period of time and use it in the moment is considered your working memory. And if your child possibly struggles with working memory, it could look as though they never hurt you in the first place because they didn't hold it long enough to work with the information. And remember, we were talking about earlier how cognition is your ability to take in the information, hold it, store it, and then use it. And working memory is doing that in the moment. So there could be some things that I've said already that if someone was talking to me, I may not have remembered because my working memory does not hold that much information. And so if your child struggles in this area, we have to think of ways to support them to hold the information in different ways. And then processing speed. This is how quickly and accurately someone can use the information that they have to apply it to the situation that they're in. How well can someone take out the information that's been placed into their mind? And how quickly can they do it? If someone struggles, like sometimes I do, with how quickly you use information, then one of the things we start to think about is whether or not this person needs more time. It doesn't necessarily mean that a person cannot think or cannot make decisions. It could mean that they're holding so much information in their mind that they need more time to sort it all out. So something is maybe slowing your child down from the moment the information is put into their mind to when they're bringing it back out to apply it, which could be a lot of things. Or your child may put information in their mind and pull out so quickly that they're onto something else already. And so that's what processing speed is. So these are the 5 main areas that we start to look at when we're measuring IQ. Verbal comprehension, the ability to be in a conversation and participate in a conversation, understand what people are saying, visual spatial, ability to kind of understand where you are in relation to other things and place other objects in relation to other things and design objects in space. I used the example of parallel parking. Architects are really good at visual spatial fluid reasoning. Your ability to understand patterns and then make decisions off of those patterns and problem solve into the future. Working memory, the ability to hold information for a short period of time and use it in the moment. And then processing speed, how quickly can you take information in and then apply it? Any questions so far? So remember I
Mr.
said,
Madyun, I just
yes.
want you to know, I have a million questions, but I'm keeping them in my head, in my short-term memory, until you get to a better stopping point.
Perfect. And one of the things we do, especially for people like me with not good working memories, is sometimes we have to write them down so we can not just keep them in our head, but actually refer back to them. And so feel free to, if I answer you, when you get to the point where you want me to answer you, and I don't answer you fully, assume that it didn't stay in my mind long enough and it wasn't in any way an attempt to not answer your question. So remember this slide earlier, descriptive classification of the different categories. So keep this in mind. 80 to 89 is low average, 90 to 109 is average, and 110 to 119 is high average. So let's look at an actual profile. Hopefully you can see this. And let's see how to understand this together. So you can see, starting on the top left, verbal comprehension is 112. It says SS, which is standard score. If you come to the bottom where it has verbal comprehension to 112, then you see this is the score we use as the actual cognitive score to pay attention to. And 112 for this student is in the high average range. If you notice that for working memory, you come down a little bit, the score is 85. And so that is still average, but in the low average range. And so both these scores are in the average range and consistent with other children that child's age. And most often, a child's score is supposed to be compared to a child of their age, how a child their age will score. But this also says that even though the child has an average working memory, is in the low range, and so they may struggle with holding a lot of information. And so they may be, if their verbal comprehension typically is 112, they probably love reading, they probably love words, but they may not hold it well, all the information well. So there's lots of different ways you can go with this, but you can argue one of the reasons they may like to read is because they get to see all the words and they don't have to rely on the working memory as much. Or they may need to write notes into their book when they're reading because they may have forgotten what happened a couple of pages earlier. Visual spatial is 105. So that's in the average range. And so the student can design, can manipulate things in space, does not necessarily struggle with putting objects in different parts of a room if they're decorating a room. The fluid reasoning is 95. So that's still in the average range, but it's a little bit lower than verbal comprehension. Now, a way to understand that fluid reasoning being in the average range is to say it's average. Now, the important thing I didn't say about these scores is normally when you get your scores, this is one test, given at one time in one moment. There are 1,000 different factors that can influence whether or not this score is a true score for your child's full capacity. So most often we give a range a range for these scores. So that 95 score for that fluid reasoning, the next time you test a student, it could be as high as 105, or it could be as low as 90 or 89. Because again, as we're trying to figure out what is true, starting from the beginning of this conversation, we're estimating, we're kind of guessing to some degree, because we have to take in consideration how much sleep the child had, whether or not the way the test taker pronounced the words influenced the child, if the child gave the best effort. And so one score doesn't always represent where a child's actual truth is in terms of their ability to reason, in terms of their working memory. But it gives you kind of an estimate, and that's how you should look at this. It gives you a gauge of where the child might be. And so if you notice at the very bottom, the full scale IQ is 90, which is kind of in the low part of average, but still average. And so that's why it's important to keep in mind that average is a large range from 80 to 119. That's what most of the population is. But how do you use this information? And any questions at the moment before I move on?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Are the scores representing my abilities? And if so, are my abilities fixed? Like, how much variance could I expect? Like, as the child gets older, do these scores jump, really large, or what can I expect?
Good question. The argument is that these scores represent someone's capacity. And what I mean by the word capacity, it represents what is possible for the student. For the most part, it is arguing that students should be able to do a certain thing at a particular level. So if your verbal comprehension is 112, it's saying that this person has the capacity to hold conversations or be in conversations at the high average range, where uh, where a smaller percent of the population can have these types of conversations. If the score for working memory is a little bit lower, for the working memory score, I'm sorry, is a little bit lower, the argument is that their capacity to hold information in their mind is not as high as some of the other students. So it's talking about what is possible or where the cap might be. But you bring up two important points. The argument is that it's looking at roughly where your child might be. And there are a lot of different factors that feed into whether or not this capacity or this cap is accurate in terms of being the highest that the child could be. But the feeling is that they are, for the most part, fixed. They should not change too much over time. If they do change, it could be because, or should be because of the things I talked about earlier: effort, energy of the child, understanding of what was being asked of them. Sometimes students don't even understand that they need to put forth their best effort. Hearing, whether like physically hearing or enunciation, mood, sleepiness, all those things factor in whether or not these scores are actually true scores, but they should stay the same over time. But in the school arena, we try to measure them every couple of years, every 3 years, to see if these scores have changed a little bit, to see if we measured them accurately the first time, or to see if they have increased or decreased. But there are lots of things that can influence them, but they should stay roughly the same. Good question. So what does that mean? What do you do with these scores? If these scores are somewhat fixed meaning they can move a couple of points, 5 or 6 or 7 points over time. They shouldn't move too much if they were measured accurately the first time. What do you do with these scores? And there are 3 things I'm going to talk about moving forward you can do with these scores. One is use strengths to generate momentum and success. I'll get to this in a little bit. 2, support their areas of less strength. And 3, keep in mind that gaps may be sources of discomfort or avoidance for your child. And I will talk about each one of these areas in a little bit. But are there any questions before we move forward with what can you do with these scores? Okay, so the first I said, use strengths to generate momentum and success. If you remember earlier, the student was very high in verbal comprehension, which means that the student probably enjoys being in conversations or enjoys reading. So one of the things we recommend that you do is focus on the strengths of your child. If they're really good at verbal comprehension, but maybe they're not as good in fluid reasoning, which is that problem solving part, or they're not as good in the processing speed, then have them read books about the areas where you want them to be strengthened. So have them read books about decision making, different situations that they might be in where you want them to learn how to make decisions and learn how to make decisions quicker than they already make decisions. The more they read about it, the more they're storing those scenarios in their mind. And when they come to that new environment, the new situation, it's not as new because they've already placed in their mind different ways to adapt to that new situation, which is what we argue intelligence is anyway, being able to adapt to their environment. So identify wherever your child's strengths might be and use those strengths to help them in areas where they might not be as strong. But tap into that. That helps with their identity, that helps with their self-esteem, and that helps them to not view schooling as a place that they are going to fail, but a place where they're going to feel loved and supported, which goes into my next point. So you go to the areas where they have less strength, and that's where you support. So you build momentum in the areas of strength, and you start to have them feel successful and love who they are. And then the areas where they're less strong, you start to support. And like I said earlier, I really had to learn how to boil water. And I found out that there's actually kind of recipes on how to boil water and paying attention to the importance of boiling water. And step-by-step guides to understanding, the ratios of water to rice and what happens when oil goes into water. For some, that causes that's common sense. But for others like me, it's not common sense. And so you have to not assume that it is common sense for your child that's struggling in a particular area, and you find recipes or steps to support them. So for the profile we had earlier, the working memory was 85. So their student may struggle holding information in their mind. And so you support them in that area. You support them with strategies for holding information. Maybe you may notice that different guides, they do better with to-do lists on the refrigerator, or writing things down, the notes, or just verbally repeating things in their out loud. Those are different things that you can offer to your child to help them to remember, or ask your child, what do you remember me saying? To strengthen or offer support in areas where they have less strength. And then the third point is, when you notice that there's a gap in one area versus another area, keep in mind that those may be sources of discomfort for your child, even avoidance. I put a picture of a sidewalk here because there are like cracks in the sidewalk. And for some people, they're comfortable walking straight through cracks in the sidewalk. Others, for various reasons, they slow down when they see cracks in the sidewalk, and some avoid it altogether. And that might be the same thing that your child may do. If they know that, or they may not even know it, but on some level, if they're experiencing that they're not processing information as quickly, and they could be in a classroom where they're staying on one particular point while the other class has moved on to another point, they may avoid putting themselves in situations where they have to do things quickly. That's something to pay attention to. Or they may just slow down a great deal. They may slow everything down themselves because they're still on point A when the class is moved on to point B. So it may cause discomfort for them, or they may avoid it altogether. And that's how you should look at a profile of your child. Just keep in mind that they may be avoiding something, or it may be causing discomfort if they're really strong in one area, but not as strong in another area. So I think our job is to support them where they're not strong, celebrate them where they are strong, and pay attention to how gaps, if they do have gaps, which we all have gaps, may lead to them avoiding where they're not strong. and cause discomfort. But if there's anything I want to leave you all with before we get to questions, is that these scores that your child may get if they take an IQ test in the school is only part of who your child is. It is a measure of the degree to which we think, which we guess, which we're assuming your child may perform in the school system, not in life. And it's a measure of the degree to which we think, we guess, or we assume we need to support your child in order for them to be successful. And we feel as though these scores should be, for the most part, stable over time. So we can continue, and we will continue to track if they change. But we feel they should be stable over time. And our job is to keep making sure the environment adjusts to your student, to your child, in order for them to have the education that they deserve.